I'm Sophie Carter, 34 years old, reeling from a betrayal that cut deeper than I ever imagined. My sister Laura convinced our family she had cancer, shaving her head and pulling our parents into her fabricated struggle, all to dodge her mounting debts. For months, I watched her play the victim, dodging doctor visits with excuses until suspicion gnawed at me. The truth exploded when I confronted her, forcing her to confess her lies. Now, I've turned the tables, shattering her perfect plan with a revelation that left her stunned. Before I dive into how I exposed her deceit and reclaimed my power, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I unravel this journey of revenge and justice. Growing up, my family felt like a snapshot from a worn-out photo album. Smiling faces at summer barbecues under the shade of old oak trees, forced laughter echoing through holiday dinners crowded with relatives, and a quiet sense of duty that stitched us together like a patchwork quilt. I'm the older sister, the one who always tried to hold the fraying edges of our lives steady, while Laura, my younger sister by 3 years, danced through existence with a wild, carefree energy that left a trail of chaos in her wake. Our parents, Thomas and Ellen, raised us in a modest house where the air was thick with the warm, cinnamon-laced scent of Mom's apple pie baking in the oven and the steady, monotonous drone of Dad's lectures about responsibility reverberated off the faded wallpaper. I soaked up those lessons like a sponge, working part-time jobs in high school, flipping burgers at a greasy diner, shelving books at the local library, even mowing lawns for neighbors, to save every penny for college, dreaming of a stable future where I could build something solid. Laura, though, squandered her allowance on the latest fashion trends, late-night outings with a rotating cast of friends, and impulsive dreams that fizzled out before they could take root. She was the family's shining star, with her bright, disarming smile and quick wit that turned every gathering into her personal stage, while I lingered in the shadows, the quiet one with a notepad stuffed with numbers no one ever bothered to glance at. Our roles were etched into us from the earliest days, as if scripted by some unseen hand. I became the dependable one, the girl who stayed behind to help Dad unclog the kitchen sink with a wrench that always seemed too big for my hands, or stirred pots on the stove when Mom's energy faded after a long day teaching third graders. Laura was the dreamer, chasing fleeting thrills, new boyfriends who came and went like seasons, half-baked plans to launch a boutique with borrowed cash, and nights out that stretched into dawn with laughter. I could hear through her bedroom wall. At 16, she'd slip out her window with a practiced ease, leaving me to stammer excuses to our parents with a nervous, "she's at a study group," that never sounded convincing. They'd exchange weary looks, calling her our wild child, with a fond shake of their heads while patting my shoulder with a tired, "You're the rock, Sophie." That label wasn't a badge of honor. It was a weight, a signal that I was the one they leaned on to patch up the cracks, to absorb the fallout without a word of complaint. I didn't resent it at first. I loved Laura, admired the fire in her that I never seemed to possess, even when it scorched those around her. But as her recklessness grew, that admiration began to wear thin, like a threadbare sweater unraveling in the wind. The first real fracture came when Laura turned 23. She'd been bouncing between waitressing shifts at a downtown diner and a parade of failed romances that left her phone buzzing with late-night apologies when she racked up credit card debt that spiraled into a mountain she couldn't climb. I stepped in with $500 from my meager savings, scraped together from months of skipping lunches, convincing myself it was a one-time rescue to keep her afloat. "You're a lifesaver," she sobbed, throwing her arms around me, her tears soaking into my worn sweater, and I clung to that gratitude like a lifeline, believing her sincerity. But it wasn't the end. Over the years, I lent her money for car repairs, a clunker that broke down again within months, costing me $300 that vanished into thin air, rent shortages that morphed into designer bags she flaunted at family dinners, $400 lost, and a so-called business loan for a pop-up shop that never materialized, draining another $600 from my account. Each time, she promised repayment with a voice thick with emotion, her eyes wide with what I now see as calculated sincerity, and each time, I swallowed my growing unease, desperate to preserve our family's fragile harmony. Dad would nod with approval, muttering, "You're the responsible one," his voice a mix of pride and exhaustion, while Mom waved it off as Laura being Laura, her tone laced with an indulgence that grated on me. I started keeping a ledger in my desk drawer, scribbling down every loan, every broken promise, the ink smudging under my trembling fingers, but I never showed it to her. I couldn't bear to be the one who shattered the peace, the one who turned our family against itself. Laura's most audacious lie began 8 months ago. It was a chilly evening when she called, her voice quivering like a leaf caught in a storm, claiming she'd been diagnosed with cancer. "It's aggressive," she whispered, her words fracturing into sobs. "I'm starting chemo next week." My stomach twisted into knots, a cold dread settling in my chest, and I rushed to her side, watching in horror as she shaved her head in front of a cracked bathroom mirror, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched a cheap razor. Our parents were gutted, their faces paling as they packed their bags to move into her cramped apartment to help her through. I took on the role of caregiver, spending hours in the kitchen chopping vegetables for hearty meals to keep her strength up, driving her to appointments she insisted on attending alone with vague excuses about hospital policies, and marveling at her boundless energy, far too vibrant for someone battling the grueling toll of chemotherapy. Doubts began to gnaw at me, a quiet voice whispering in the back of my mind, but I silenced it, convincing myself it was my imagination playing tricks, my loyalty to her blinding me to the truth. I wanted to believe in her, to hold on to the sister I thought I knew, the one who'd once shared secrets under the covers during thunderstorms. Those doubts grew louder with each passing day. Laura's excuses for skipping family visits to the doctor piled up like a stack of unpaid bills. Privacy concerns she couldn't explain, strict hospital rules she couldn't cite, and her late-night outings, which she brushed off as stress relief with a laugh, clashed with the image of a cancer patient wasting away. I noticed her skin glowed with an unnatural health. Her laughter rang out during phone calls with friends, and her stamina seemed untouched by the treatments she described in hushed, dramatic tones. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside, chalking it up to her resilience, her ability to defy odds, until a moment last month changed everything. I was grabbing a coffee one rainy morning in Portland, the city's misty air wrapping around me like a damp cloak, when I ran into Karen, the office manager at Laura's supposed oncologist's office. We exchanged pleasantries over steaming mugs, and I casually mentioned Laura's treatment, expecting a nod of recognition. Instead, Karen's brow furrowed deeply. "We don't have a patient by that name," she said, her tone puzzled, her eyes searching mine for an explanation. My heart thudded against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of disbelief, as I thanked her with a forced smile, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions. That night, I couldn't sleep, the ledger of her unpaid debts flashing before my eyes like a neon sign, each unpaid loan a clue I'd ignored for too long. The quiet of my room felt suffocating, the weight of her deception pressing down on me like a storm about to break. Something was terribly wrong, and I knew I had to face it. I couldn't let it rest. The next morning, I called the oncologist's office myself, masking my voice with a shaky imitation of concern, and got the same chilling answer. No record of Laura existed in their system. Her flimsy excuses about confidentiality crumbled under my persistence, her voice cracking as she tried to deflect, and her refusal to let anyone accompany her to appointments felt like a glaring red flag I could no longer ignore. I spent days replaying her stories, her excuses, the way she'd leaned on our parents' sympathy, and it all began to unravel. Last week, I confronted her at her apartment, my hands trembling as I stood in her cluttered living room, the air thick with the scent of her cheap perfume. "What's the truth, Laura?" I demanded, my voice a volatile mix of fear and fury, my chest tight with anticipation. She collapsed into a heap on her sagging couch, sobbing as she confessed through ragged breaths. It was all a fabrication, cancer, chemo, the works, to cover a $20,000 debt accrued from maxed-out cards and an eviction notice she'd hidden. Our parents' move had let her halt bill payments, living off their care while I'd been funding her past mistakes with every dollar I'd scraped together. I was livid, my trust reduced to ashes, my hands clenching into fists as I stared at her tear-streaked face. "You have 24 hours to tell them," I said, my tone icy, each word a hammer strike. "Or I will." She pleaded with me not to, her voice breaking as she insisted it would destroy her bond with our parents, but I knew I couldn't protect her lie any longer. The next day, when she stayed silent, I gathered my evidence, bank statements, her tearful admissions scribbled on a napkin, and steeled myself to face the fallout. The weight of her deception, a storm cloud hovering over my every thought. The moment Karen's words sliced through me, a tempest erupted inside. A chaotic whirl of disbelief, searing anger, and a gnawing dread that refused to loosen its grip. I stood frozen in that coffee shop, the bitter scent of roasted beans swirling around me like a fog, my hands trembling around a lukewarm cup as her confusion, "We don't have a patient by that name," reverberated like a thunderclap in my skull. Laura's meticulously crafted lies were unraveling, thread by thread, and the weight of it crashed into my chest like a freight train derailing. I forced a shaky smile, thanking her with a voice that teetered on the edge of breaking, and stumbled out into the gray Portland drizzle, the city's quiet streets dissolving into a watery blur as tears burned my eyes. The evidence I'd stashed away, bank statements, her unpaid debts scrawled in my tattered ledger, suddenly felt like a live grenade, its pin yanked free by the truth I could no longer evade. But the path ahead was a treacherous labyrinth, every step a potential detonation of the fragile peace I'd clung to with my family, and I knew this journey would push me to the edge of my sanity. Back in my cramped apartment, the silence was a suffocating shroud. The faint hum of the refrigerator, a mocking taunt of the normalcy I'd lost forever. I replayed every interaction with Laura, her tearful calls about chemo side effects that sounded rehearsed, the way she'd brush off my offers to join her at appointments with vague murmurs about hospital policies, the boundless energy she exuded that mocked the exhaustion of a cancer patient. I dismissed it as her resilience, her unyielding spirit, but now it screamed a deliberate deception, a performance honed to perfection. The ledger in my desk drawer, once a quiet record of her debts, had transformed into a weapon, each entry a jagged scar of betrayal etched into the fabric of my trust. I couldn't shake the image of Thomas and Ellen, my parents, packing their lives into worn suitcases to care for her, their faces lined with worry and love, all built on a foundation of her lies that now felt like quicksand beneath my feet. My stomach churned with a bitter cocktail of guilt. Had my years of bailing her out laid the groundwork for this? And a fury that surged like a tidal wave, washing away my doubts in a flood of righteous anger. She'd twisted our love into a noose around our necks, and I was done being her unwitting pawn, her silent enabler in a game I hadn't known I was playing. The first challenge was verifying the truth, a task that felt like wading through a swamp of uncertainty and paralyzing fear. I called the oncologist's office the next day, masking my voice with a shaky imitation of concern, asking about Laura's treatment schedule with a knot of dread tightening in my throat. The receptionist's polite but firm response, "I'm sorry, we have no record of a Laura Carter under our care," sent a shiver cascading down my spine, a cold confirmation that turned my blood to ice. I pressed, claiming I was a worried sister desperate for updates, my voice quivering with each word, my heart pounding against my ribcage. But the answer remained an unyielding wall of denial that tested my resolve. Laura's excuses about privacy laws, which she'd tossed at me like confetti during our talks, now sounded like flimsy paper shields crumbling under scrutiny, and her insistence on attending appointments alone felt like a fortress built to conceal her guilt. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows on my face, scouring medical forums and cancer support groups, absorbing every detail I'd overlooked. Her lack of weight loss, her untouched appetite, the absence of medical equipment like IV stands or pill bottles in her cluttered apartment. Each revelation stoked my resolve like a furnace stoked with coal, but it also deepened my isolation, a solitary vigil in the face of her elaborate ruse that left me questioning my own judgment. Word of Laura's illness had spread like wildfire through our tight-knit social circle, and the whispers morphed into a deafening roar that trailed me like a relentless shadow. At a grocery store in Portland a week later, Mrs. Hargrove, an old neighbor with a sharp tongue and a cart brimming with greens, cornered me by the produce aisle, her eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and pity. "Heard Laura's been sick," she said, her tone dripping with sympathy as she adjusted her glasses with a creak. "You holding up with all that, dear?" I nodded, forcing a tight smile that felt like a brittle mask, my throat constricting with the lie I couldn't yet unravel, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me. The city's small-town intimacy, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a suffocating net, every glance from a passerby or acquaintance a silent judgment I couldn't shake, a constant reminder of the secret I carried. At work, my boss, Mr. Daniels, a gruff but kind man with a penchant for strong coffee that stained his desk, noticed my distraction during a team meeting, his pen tapping a restless rhythm as I stumbled through a presentation on new client proposals. "Everything all right, Sophie?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern, his voice cutting through my fog. "Family stuff," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze, the shame of my family's secret searing my cheeks like a brand. He granted me a week's leave, a rare gesture of understanding that came with a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, but it only deepened my solitude, leaving me alone with a mind that churned with endless, torturous scenarios. Support emerged from unexpected allies, a lifeline in the growing darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. My best friend, Mia, a nurse with a no-nonsense edge and a steady hand that had comforted countless patients, became my rock. Over coffee one rainy afternoon, the steam rising between us like a fragile bridge, I poured out the whole sordid tale. The fake cancer, the debts, the encounter with Karen, my voice breaking with each word. "That's beyond despicable," Mia said, her mug slamming onto the table with a sharp clink that echoed in the room, her eyes blazing with a fury that mirrored my own. "She's manipulating your parents, Sophie. You need to dig deeper and expose this." Her bluntness sliced through my fog, a beacon that steadied my shaking hands and gave me a push I didn't know I needed. She lent me thick medical journals, their pages dense with terms like neutropenia and myelosuppression that I struggled to decode, and guided me to check for physical signs. Laura's lack of pallor, her clear skin, the absence of chemo's telltale toll. Another friend, James, a tech-savvy coworker with a quiet intensity that hid a brilliant mind, offered to help trace her financial records, his offer a ray of hope in my despair. He set up a detailed spreadsheet, his fingers dancing over the keyboard with a hacker's grace, pulling public data that revealed withdrawals aligning with her treatment timeline, but leading to luxury boutiques, bars, and even a spa day that mocked her supposed suffering. Their support lifted me, a buoy in a sea of doubt. But it also amplified the pressure. I couldn't let their faith in me crumble under the weight of my indecision. I plunged into the investigation with a fervor that surprised even myself, a fire that burned away my lingering doubts and fueled my determination. I called every oncology clinic within a 50-mile radius, my voice cracking as I posed as a concerned relative, asking about Laura's treatment history with a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The answers were a monotonous chant: no Laura Carter, no appointments, no trace. Each call a hammer strike against her lies that reverberated in my ears. I pressed harder, my fingers numb from dialing, my patience wearing thin like a thread about to snap. But the responses remained a wall of denial that tested my resolve to its limits. I dug through her social media accounts, scrolling past posts of her laughing at a bar she'd claimed was off limits due to immune issues. Photos from a beach trip she'd labeled a rest day with a carefree grin, tagged by friends who seemed blissfully unaware of her supposed plight. The evidence piled up, a mountain of contradictions that fueled my rage and sharpened my focus like a blade honed for battle. I approached her landlord discreetly, a wiry man with a perpetual scowl and a cluttered office that smelled of stale cigarettes, and learned she'd missed rent for months. The eviction notice buried in a stack of unopened mail he handed over with a disinterested shrug. I cross-referenced her bank statements, noting withdrawals that coincided with her chemo days, but led to lavish dinners and online shopping sprees. Each clue was a brick in the wall of truth I was building, a fortress against her lies. But it also deepened my solitude, a lonely crusade that left me questioning my own strength. The pressure from our parents grew into an unrelenting tide that threatened to drown me. Thomas called daily, his voice heavy with concern, asking about Laura's progress with a tremor that broke my heart into jagged pieces. "Is she eating enough?" he'd ask, his words a plea for reassurance that I couldn't give without lying. Ellen followed with tearful updates, her hands shaking as she described Laura's bravery through the phone, her voice a fragile thread of hope, unaware of the fraud that underpinned it all. I had to lie, my tongue twisting around fabricated details. "She's resting today," or "the doctor says she's stable," my stomach churning with every word, the guilt a lead weight that anchored me to the floor. The weight of their trust in her, their unconditional love, made my deception feel like a betrayal of my own soul. But my anger burned brighter, a flame that demanded justice for the truth they deserved to know. Relatives joined the chorus, Aunt Patricia calling with offers of prayers, her voice soft but insistent like a gentle rain, while Cousin Mark texted condolences that felt like barbs piercing my skin. I dodged their questions, my silence a fragile shield that cracked under their concern, but the weight of their expectations pressed down, isolating me in a bubble of my own making, a prisoner of the secret I carried. Work became a battleground of distraction and despair that tested my limits. Mr. Daniels pulled me aside after another missed deadline, his office smelling of stale coffee and printer ink, his expression a mix of concern and frustration that cut through my haze. "Sophie, you're slipping," he said, his tone firm but kind, his pen tapping a restless beat that mirrored my racing heart. "Is it your sister?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes, the shame of my family's secret searing my cheeks like a brand. He granted me a week's leave, a rare gesture of understanding that came with a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, but it only deepened my solitude, leaving me alone with a mind that churned with endless, torturous scenarios of confrontation and failure. Friends noticed too. My coworker Lisa asked about Laura over a hurried lunch, her concern genuine but probing like a surgeon's scalpel, and I deflected with a weak smile, the lie growing heavier with each evasion, a burden I couldn't shrug off. I started avoiding social calls, my phone silenced, the silence of my apartment a stark contrast to the chaos raging within me. a prisoner of my own silence that echoed with the ghosts of her lies. The investigation deepened into a relentless pursuit that consumed my days and nights. I enlisted Mia's help, her nursing expertise guiding me to scrutinize Laura's physical signs. Her lack of weight loss, her clear complexion unmarred by chemo's toll, the absence of the telltale scars or pallor that should have marked her struggle. She lent me thick medical journals, their pages dense with terms like neutropenia and myelosuppression that I stumbled over in the dim light of my living room. But each fact solidified my suspicions like concrete hardening in a mold. James set up a detailed spreadsheet, his fingers dancing over the keyboard with a hacker's grace, pulling public financial data that revealed withdrawals aligning with her treatment timeline, but leading to luxury boutiques, bars, a spa day that mocked her supposed suffering, and even a weekend getaway she'd hidden with a friend. I visited her apartment unannounced one evening, peering through the window to see her laughing with a group, a wine glass glinting in her hand, the sight a dagger to my trust that left me breathless and shaking. I tracked her movements, noting late-night exits she'd claimed were rest days, each observation a nail in the coffin of her lies, a hammer strike against the image I'd held of her. I interviewed a former coworker of hers, a quiet woman named Rachel, who hinted at Laura's financial troubles months before the cancer claim, adding another layer to the puzzle. Each piece of evidence was a step toward confrontation, but it also frayed my nerves, the fear of being wrong warring with the certainty of her guilt, a tightrope walk over a chasm of doubt that threatened to swallow me whole. The plan took shape over late-night sessions with Mia and James, our voices hushed in my dimly lit living room, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee and determination. The table was a battlefield of printouts, coffee cups stained with sleepless nights, a recorder James insisted we use, and a notepad where I scribbled strategies that shifted with each new fact. "She needs to confess on tape," he said, his voice a steady anchor in my storm. "For your parents' sake, to give them closure." I hesitated, the thought of betraying Laura's trust a bitter pill that stuck in my throat. The memory of her crocodile tears and rehearsed excuses flashing before my eyes. But the weight of her deception hardened my resolve like steel forged in a furnace. Mia suggested a direct approach, storming in with a barrage of questions, while James proposed a sting operation, luring her into a recorded admission with a casual visit disguised as concern. I settled on a middle ground, confront her at her place, demand the truth face to face with the recorder rolling, and give her a chance to come clean before I took the next step. The days leading up to it were a haze of sleepless nights, my mind racing with endless what-ifs. What if she denied it with more lies? What if our parents turned their backs on me, blaming me for tearing the family apart? The pressure from their calls intensified, Ellen's voice breaking as she asked, "Is Laura improving?" With a desperation that tore at my soul, her words a plea I couldn't answer honestly. I dodged, my guilt a heavy cloak that draped over my shoulders like a shroud. But my determination sharpened like a blade, cutting through the fear and doubt. Last week, I stood outside her door, my heart a wild drumbeat of anticipation, evidence clutched in my sweaty hands, the air thick with the promise of a storm I'd set in motion, ready to face the consequences of my choice. The moment I stood outside Laura's apartment door, my heart thundered like a war drum rolling across a desolate battlefield, each beat a relentless countdown to the confrontation I'd both dreaded with every fiber of my soul and yearned for with a fire that consumed my thoughts. My hands, slick with a cold sweat that mirrored the turmoil churning like a tempest within me, clutched a manila envelope bulging with evidence, bank statements tracing her extravagant spending sprees on designer clothes and lavish nights out, her tearful confessions scribbled on a crumpled napkin stained with the salt of her tears, the meticulously compiled spreadsheet from James that mapped her financial deceit with precision. while the recorder in my pocket felt like a live grenade, its red light a silent promise of the explosion that would shatter her world. The air hung heavy with a tension that crackled like static electricity before a storm. The faint hum of traffic from the street below, a distant murmur of a world blissfully unaware of the cataclysm brewing within the walls of that modest building. I'd given her 24 hours to come clean, a deadline she'd let slip by with a silence that screamed her guilt louder than any confession, her pleas to shield her bond with our parents echoing hollowly in the hollows of my memory like a broken record. Now it was my moment to act, and the weight of that responsibility bore down like a thunderhead swollen with rain, ready to unleash its fury upon the fragile peace I'd clung to with my family like a lifeline. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the weathered wood with a force that betrayed the steely resolve hardening in my chest, the sound reverberating through the stillness like a clarion call to battle, and waited, the seconds stretching into an agonizing eternity that tested the limits of my courage and pushed me to the brink of collapse. Laura opened the door, her eyes widening in a flash of surprise that quickly morphed into a flicker of panic, a crack in the facade she'd so carefully maintained over months of deception. Her hair, regrown into a short, uneven crop since the dramatic shave that had fooled us all into believing her fabricated illness, framed a face that still carried the deceptive glow of health she'd masked with her cancer charade, a glow that now seemed a mocking betrayal of our trust. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a shaky attempt at normalcy, a thin veneer over the tremor in her hands as she adjusted the sleeve of her faded sweater, her fingers betraying her unease with a nervous twitch. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The cluttered living room, a chaotic sprawl of takeout containers, spilling greasy remnants onto the carpet, unopened bills stacked like a tower of secrets teetering on the edge of collapse, and a sagging couch that sagged under the weight of her lies, closing in around us like a trap set to spring, the air thick with the stale scent of her desperation. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath my skin like a pot about to boil over, a controlled fire ready to consume her web of deceit. I pulled out the recorder, setting it on the coffee table with a deliberate click that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, the sound bouncing off the walls like a death knell, and her face paled, a mask of fear slipping over her features as she took a step back, her breath hitching. "What's this?" she stammered, her fingers twitching toward it as if to snatch it away and silence its potential. But I cut her off, my words sharp as a guillotine descending with lethal precision. "I know the truth, Laura. The cancer, the chemo, it's all a lie. You've got one chance to explain before I take this to Mom and Dad, and that chance is slipping away with every second you waste." Her reaction was a floodgate shattering under the crushing pressure of my accusation, a dam breaking under the weight of her own guilt. She sank onto the couch, her hands flying to her face as sobs racked her body, the sound raw and unfiltered, a cry that filled the room with its desperate, jagged edges, a wail that seemed to carry the weight of her sins. "Please, Sophie, don't do this," she begged, her voice muffled through her fingers, her shoulders heaving with each gasping breath as tears streamed down her cheeks like rain on a shattered window pane. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was drowning in debt, and I didn't know what else to do, what other path to take." I stood over her, unmoved, my anger a fortress against her tears, my stance unyielding as I crossed my arms, my eyes boring into her with an intensity that could melt steel. "Drowning? You fabricated a terminal illness, shaved your head to sell the lie with a performance worthy of an Oscar, and let our parents move in to support you while you stopped paying bills and lived off their love like a parasite. That's not drowning. That's manipulation on a scale I can't even begin to fathom, a betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife." She looked up, her eyes red and pleading, tears streaking her cheeks like rivers of regret, her voice a whisper of desperation that trembled with fear. I was going to stage a recovery next month, tell them I beat it miraculously with a story of hope and healing that would erase the pain. It would have been over then. You don't understand the pressure I was under, the walls closing in, the fear of losing everything I'd built on sand. Her words ignited a fire in me, the audacity of her plan fueling my resolve, a blaze that scorched away any lingering sympathy and left only a burning need for justice, a flame that refused to be extinguished. Pressure? You put that on us, Laura. You turned our love into a weapon against us, a sword you wielded with ruthless intent. I gave you a chance to come clean, and you chose to protect your lie with a coward's silence. Now, I'm done shielding you from the consequences of your actions, from the reckoning you've earned. I turned on the recorder, its red light a silent sentinel glowing in the dim light of her living room, a beacon of truth in the darkness of her deceit, and demanded she confess on tape, my voice a command that brooked no argument, a tone that carried the weight of my betrayal and the strength of my resolve. Her resistance crumbled under the unrelenting pressure of my gaze, her shoulders slumping as if the burden of her lies had finally crushed her spirit, and she spilled everything. $20,000 in credit card debt accrued from maxed-out cards, reckless spending on designer clothes that adorned her closet, lavish nights out that filled her social media with lies, eviction notices she'd hidden in a drawer beneath a pile of unpaid bills, the way she'd used our parents' love as a lifeline to cover her tracks while living rent-free in a life built on their sacrifices. Each admission was a nail driven into the coffin of her deception, her voice breaking as she admitted to faking symptoms with makeup tricks learned from online tutorials, dodging appointments with fabricated excuses about hospital protocols that she'd rehearsed like a script, and thriving off their care while I funded her past mistakes with every dollar I'd scraped together from late-night shifts, skipped vacations, and a life of frugality. I felt a mix of triumph and nausea, the truth a bitter victory that left me shaking, my hands clenching the edge of the table as her words painted a portrait of betrayal I could barely stomach, a canvas stained with the blood of our trust and the tears of our family. You have until tomorrow to tell them, I said, switching off the recorder with a decisive snap that echoed like a judge's gavel, gathering my things with a deliberate slowness that underscored my control, my movements a statement of finality that left no room for negotiation. She grabbed my arm, her grip desperate, her nails digging into my skin like claws seeking purchase, her voice a plea that bordered on hysteria. Please, it'll ruin me with them. They'll never forgive me. Don't do this to your own sister, Sophie. Don't tear our family apart. I pulled free, my voice cold as the steel of a blade forged in the fire of my anger. You should have thought of that before you lied, before you built this house of cards on our love. 24 hours, Laura. I left, the door slamming behind me with a force that reverberated through my bones, a sound that marked the end of her reign of deceit, my mind racing with the fallout I'd just set in motion, a storm I could no longer contain, a tempest that would reshape our lives. The next day, when she didn't confess, the decision crystallized in my mind like ice forming on a frozen lake under a winter sky, a clarity that cut through the haze of doubt with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I called Thomas and Ellen, my voice steady but my heart a frantic drumroll that echoed in my ears like the beat of a war march, and asked them to meet me at their house, a place that had once been a sanctuary, now transformed into a battleground, where family ties would be tested and broken. The drive there was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened under the strain, my mind rehearsing every word with a precision that belied the inner chaos swirling within me, the envelope of evidence a heavy anchor on the passenger seat beside me, its contents a ticking time bomb ready to detonate our family's peace. When I arrived, the familiar living room with its worn couch sagging under years of memories, faded family photos on the mantel capturing happier times now tinged with irony, and the faint scent of Mom's lavender candles flickering in the air felt like a stage set for a tragedy about to unfold. A theater where the curtain was about to rise on a drama of betrayal and reckoning. "What's going on, Sophie?" Dad asked, his brow furrowed with a mix of confusion and concern, his hands resting on his knees as if bracing for a blow he couldn't foresee. Mom wrung her hands, her eyes searching mine with a desperation that twisted my gut into knots, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "You look upset, honey," she said, her voice trembling with a fragility that mirrored the fragility of our family. I took a deep breath, the air thick with anticipation, a charged atmosphere that crackled with the unspoken, and pulled out the recorder and the documents, spreading them across the coffee table like a war map drawn in ink and tears, a battlefield laid bare. "Laura's been lying about her cancer. It's a fake to cover her debts. She confessed to me yesterday, and I have proof to back it up." The silence that followed was a vacuum, a void that sucked the oxygen from the room, leaving us suspended in a moment of disbelief that stretched the fabric of time into an endless thread. Thomas's face drained of color, his hands clenching into fists on his knees, the veins standing out like cords straining against his skin. A map of his rising fury, while Ellen's eyes filled with tears, a sob escaping her lips like a wounded animal's cry that pierced the stillness with its raw pain. "No, that can't be," Mom whispered, her voice breaking into fragments that scattered across the floor like shattered glass, her hands flying to her mouth as if to hold back the truth she couldn't bear. "She's been so brave, so strong through it all, fighting with a courage we admired and clung to like a lifeline." I played the recording, Laura's voice crackling through the speaker like a ghost from a haunted past, her admissions a knife twisting in their hearts. "I didn't know what else to do," her recorded plea echoed, a confession that hung in the air like a guillotine's blade poised to fall, a sound that shattered their illusions. Dad slammed his fist on the table, the sound a gunshot that shattered the silence, his voice a roar of betrayal that shook the walls and rattled the framed photos. "How could she do this to us? How could our own daughter betray us with such a cruel fabrication?" he demanded, his eyes blazing with a fire that mirrored the inferno within me. I explained the debts, the eviction, the way she'd used their love as a lifeline to sustain her lie, each word a weight I had to lift alone, my voice steady despite the storm raging within me, a calm center in the eye of the hurricane. Mom collapsed into a chair, her sobs a mournful tune that filled the room with its sorrowful melody, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands, her grief a tangible presence that weighed on my conscience. Dad paced, his anger a tempest I'd unleashed with my revelation, his footsteps a rhythmic march of fury across the worn carpet, his shadow a dark omen on the wall. Laura arrived an hour later, her face a mask of defiance as she stormed into the house, her eyes locking onto mine with a fury that matched the inferno blazing in my chest, a clash of wills that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. "What did you do?" she shouted, her voice trembling with rage, her hands balled into fists at her sides as if ready to strike, her posture a challenge to my authority. "You had no right to out me like this, Sophie, to drag our family through the mud and expose our dirty laundry for all to see." I stood my ground, my evidence spread across the table like a battlefield strewn with the fallen remnants of her lies, my stance unyielding as I faced her head-on, my chin lifted in defiance. "You had your chance to tell them, Laura. I gave you 24 hours, a generous window of grace, and you chose to protect your lie instead of facing the truth with the courage you claim to have. This is on you, not me, and the consequences are yours to bear." She turned to our parents, her hands outstretched in a plea that trembled with desperation, her voice cracking under the strain of her crumbling facade. I was going to stage a recovery next month, make it right with a miraculous story of hope and healing that would mend the wounds. She ruined everything, turned my mistake into a public execution that destroyed my life. Dad's face hardened, his voice a low growl that rumbled through the room like distant thunder rolling over the hills. You lied to us, Laura. For months, you let us believe you were dying, a lie that broke our hearts with every tear we shed. How can we trust you now after this unforgivable betrayal that has shattered our family? Mom's tears flowed freely, her words a whisper lost in her sobs, a fragile thread of disbelief that unraveled in the air. Our little girl, how could you deceive us with such a cruel fabrication that turned our love into a tool for your gain? The argument escalated into a clash of voices that filled the room with a cacophony of tension, each word a spark igniting the powder keg of our fractured family, a symphony of pain and accusation that reverberated off the walls. Laura accused me of treachery, her words sharp as shattered glass, cutting through the air with a venomous edge. Family should defend each other, not expose each other like this, tearing us apart for your own satisfaction and leaving us to bleed in the open, she cried, her fists trembling with indignation, her face a mask of wounded pride that masked her shame. I met her gaze, unflinching. My eyes locked with hers in a battle of wills that felt like a duel to the death, a contest of strength and truth. Family doesn't lie about cancer to use their parents as a financial crutch, Laura. You broke that trust, not me, with a lie that poisoned our love. I had to protect them from the web of deceit you spun around us with your selfish scheme. Thomas stepped between us, his voice a commanding cut through the chaos, his presence a wall of authority that demanded obedience and silenced the room with its power. Enough! Both of you, sit down and be silent, he ordered, his tone a whip crack that echoed with the weight of his disappointment. He turned to Laura, his eyes cold as the steel of a winter blade, his jaw set with a resolve that brooked no argument. You need to leave this house. We need time to process this unthinkable act of betrayal that has shattered our trust and broken our hearts. Her face crumpled, a mix of shock and defiance warring in her expression, her lips quivering as she struggled to find words to defend herself. But she grabbed her bag and stormed out, the door slamming with a finality that echoed like a judge's gavel striking wood, leaving a void that swallowed the warmth of the room and left a chill in its wake. Mom buried her face deeper in her hands, her sobs a quiet lament that pierced the silence like a dirge played on a broken violin, while Dad stared at the floor, his silence heavier than any words could convey, a man grappling with the ruin of his faith in his daughter, his world turned upside down. The aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions that swept through the house like a tornado, tearing through a fragile landscape, leaving destruction in its path. Ellen wouldn't look at me, her tears a glistening barrier between us, her shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of her daughter's lies, her grief a tangible presence that weighed on my conscience like a stone. Thomas's anger simmered, a low boil directed at both Laura and me, his voice tight with accusation as he turned to me with a gaze that cut like glass. You should have come to us first, Sophie, he said, his words a knife twisting in my side, his eyes searching for an explanation that would ease his pain. We could have handled it as a family, worked through this together with the love we've always had. I shook my head, my voice firm despite the ache blooming in my chest, my hands steady on the table as I faced his judgment. She had her chance, Dad. I couldn't let her keep lying to you, feeding you a fantasy while she drained your love and trust with her deceit. You deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurts, no matter the cost to our unity. The room felt like a battlefield, strewn with the wreckage of our bonds, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the sting of betrayal, a scene frozen in the aftermath of a war that had left scars on every heart. I left them to their grief, the evidence still scattered across the table like relics of a fallen empire. My heart a tangle of relief that the truth was out and regret for the pain it had inflicted on those I loved. A bittersweet burden I carried alone. That night, Laura called, her voice a volatile mix of rage and desperation that crackled through the phone like static on a broken line, a sound that grated on my nerves. "You've ruined my life, Sophie. They'll never forgive me now. How could you do this to your own sister, to our family, to the bond we once shared?" I hung up, the weight of her words lingering like a bruise on my soul, a mark that throbbed with every heartbeat, but my resolve held firm, a steel core forged in the crucible of her deceit, unyielding against her accusations and the guilt she tried to impose. The next morning, the fallout spread like ripples across a still pond, disturbing the calm of our family's fragile facade with a force that rippled through my life and left tremors in its wake. Thomas texted, his words stark and cold. "Stay away for a while, Sophie. We need space to heal from this wound you've opened." A message that sliced through me like a blade, leaving a wound that throbbed with every reread, a cut that refused to close. Ellen's silence was louder, her absence from my calls a void that echoed with her pain. Her unreturned voicemails a testament to her heartbreak that cut deeper than any blade, a silence that spoke volumes of her shattered trust. I tried calling, leaving voicemails that went unanswered, my voice cracking as I pleaded for a chance to explain, to bridge the gap her lies had created with a bridge of understanding. "Mom, Dad, I did this for you. To protect you from her lies," I said into the void, my words swallowed by the silence, lost in the ether of their grief. The isolation was suffocating, a solitary confinement within the four walls of my apartment, where every creak of the floorboards reminded me of the family I'd lost. The laughter that once filled those spaces, now a distant memory replaced by the ghosts of our broken trust. Laura's calls persisted, her voice a relentless barrage of venom and pleading that grated on my nerves like sandpaper on raw skin. "You've destroyed everything, Sophie," she said one night, her words a dagger aimed at my heart, a thrust meant to wound. "They hate me now, and it's your fault. You've torn us apart with your righteous anger." I muted her, the guilt warring with my conviction. A battlefield within me where duty and love clashed, but the evidence, her confession, the financial trail, stood as my shield, a bulwark against her blame that held firm against the storm. The community's reaction was a mixed bag, a kaleidoscope of support and scorn that painted my days with contrasting colors, a palette of judgment and compassion. At a neighborhood book club meeting held in a cozy living room, a friend, Rachel, pulled me aside in a quiet corner, her voice low and conspiratorial, like a secret shared in confidence. "I heard about Laura," she whispered, her eyes soft with understanding, a warmth that thawed the ice in my chest. "You did what you had to. Some of us are rooting for you, Sophie. You're not alone in this fight." Her words were a lifeline, a thread of hope in the darkness, a beacon that guided me through the storm, but others, like Mrs. Grayson from down the street, gave me cold shoulders as I passed her on the sidewalk, her disapproval a silent sermon delivered with a turned back and a sniff of disdain. At work, a colleague, Tom, offered a sympathetic nod over the coffee machine. His understanding a rare light in the gloom, a flicker of kindness in a sea of judgment, while a client meeting turned awkward when a whisper about family drama reached their ears, their trust in me wavering like a candle in the wind. The pressure was relentless, a weight that tested my resolve, a constant hum of judgment that followed me like a shadow cast by the sun, but Mia and James remained my anchors, their presence a rock in the shifting sands of my life. We met weekly at a quiet diner, the clink of cutlery a backdrop to our talks, their encouragement a balm against the chaos that threatened to engulf me. "She's the one who lied," James said, his voice firm as he slid the spreadsheet across the table, a testament to her deceit that reinforced my choice. "You're the hero here, Sophie, even if it doesn't feel like it now, even if the weight of their pain presses down on you." Their belief in me fueled my determination, a fire that burned brighter with each passing day, a flame that refused to be extinguished by the weight of my family's suffering. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions and repercussions that tested the limits of my endurance, a ride that left me breathless and battered. Thomas's text lingered in my phone, a digital scar I couldn't erase, its words a constant reminder of the rift I'd widened with my actions, a wound that refused to heal. Ellen's silence stretched into a week, her absence a gaping wound in our family fabric. Her unreturned voicemails a testament to her heartbreak that cut deeper than any blade, a silence that spoke volumes of her shattered trust and the love she couldn't express. I visited a counselor, Dr. Patel, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes that held a depth of understanding, a well of wisdom that drew me in. "You acted out of love for your parents," she said, her voice a soothing balm that eased the raw edges of my guilt, a gentle hand on a bruised soul. "The regret is natural, a reflection of your care, but the truth was a necessary act of courage that honored their dignity." Her words began to heal the fractures, a slow mending of my spirit that offered a glimmer of peace amidst the storm, a light at the end of a dark tunnel. I threw myself into work, the rhythm of deadlines a distraction from the pain, a lifeline that pulled me from the abyss, but the effort left me exhausted, my focus fractured by the echoes of Laura's betrayal that lingered like a haunting melody. The road to reconciliation with my parents loomed as a distant hope, a horizon shrouded in fog that obscured the path forward, a journey I couldn't yet begin. But for now, the victory of exposing Laura's lie was mine to hold, a bittersweet triumph that shaped my path forward with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I met Mia and James again, their support a constant in the shifting sands of my life, a rock that anchored me amidst the chaos, and we planned the next steps. How to approach Thomas and Ellen with an olive branch, how to rebuild what had been broken with the mortar of truth. The taste of justice was bitter, a flavor laced with the sting of loss, a brew that mingled the sweetness of vindication with the salt of sorrow, but it was a taste I was learning to accept, a badge of honor earned through the fire of my resolve. The community's mixed reactions continued, a dance of approval and disapproval that I navigated with a newfound strength, my head held high despite the whispers that followed me like a persistent breeze. At a local park, a friend, Sarah, offered a quiet smile as we sat on a bench, her support a silent vote of confidence that warmed my heart, while a distant cousin's cold stare at a family event reminded me of the divide that separated us, a chasm I couldn't yet bridge. The pressure was a crucible, forging me into someone stronger, a warrior tempered by the flames of adversity, and with Mia and James by my side, their voices a chorus of encouragement, I faced the uncertain future with a determination that refused to waver. The echoes of Laura's lies a fading memory in the light of my triumph, a victory that stood as a testament to my resilience. The days following that explosive confrontation left me adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The echoes of Laura's slammed door and my parents' shattered silence ringing in my ears like a persistent tolling bell that refused to fade. I returned to my apartment, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos I'd unleashed upon our family, and sank onto my worn couch, the manila envelope of evidence now a relic of the battle I'd waged, its contents a testament to the truth I'd forced into the light. The weight of Thomas's text, "Stay away for a while, Sophie," pressed against my chest like a stone, a cold reminder of the rift I'd widened with my actions, while Ellen's silence stretched into a void that gnawed at the edges of my resolve, a silence that spoke of her pain and my isolation. I'd expected a wave of relief after exposing Laura's lie, a cleansing tide to wash away the bitterness, but instead, I felt a hollow ache, a mix of victory for the truth and loss for the family I'd known, a duality that tangled my emotions into knots. Yet, beneath that ache, a quiet strength began to stir, a resolve to rebuild what I could salvage and protect myself from further harm with the wisdom I'd gained. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but I was ready to face it, step by step, with the lessons of this ordeal as my compass and shield. Laura's transformation came slowly, a reluctant evolution born from the ashes of her deceit, a phoenix struggling to rise from the ruins she'd created. A week after the confrontation, she reached out, her voice subdued over the phone, a far cry from the rage she'd hurled at me in the heat of battle, a tone that hinted at a shift within her. "I'm starting to pay off the debt," she said, her words halting, each syllable weighed with the burden of her past. "I got a job at a cafe downtown. Nothing fancy, just serving coffee and wiping tables, but it's a start to dig myself out." I listened, my grip on the phone tight, my breath held as I weighed her sincerity against the scars she'd left, unsure whether to trust this new leaf she claimed to turn. She admitted to seeking help from a financial counselor, a professional she'd found through a community center, a step she'd never considered in her reckless days, and promised to repay the loans I'd given her, starting with small installments sent through a payment app. "I know I messed up, Sophie," she whispered, her voice breaking with a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused." The apology felt genuine, a crack in the armor she'd worn, but I kept my distance, wary of being drawn back into her orbit, my heart guarded by the lessons of her betrayal. Over the next month, she sent $100, then $150, each payment accompanied by a text of gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a chance." That chipped away at my anger like a sculptor's chisel on stone. It wasn't forgiveness, not a full embrace of reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a sign she was trying to reclaim her life without leaning on our parents' unconditional support, a fragile bridge we might one day cross. My own growth emerged from the ashes of that family storm, a phoenix rising with a newfound confidence that felt like a suit of armor forged in the fire of adversity. I started therapy with Dr. Patel, her office a haven of soft light filtering through sheer curtains and gentle wisdom that wrapped around me like a warm blanket, where I unpacked the guilt that had clung to me like damp clothing after a rain. "You acted out of love for your parents," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of my emotions, a lifeline that pulled me from the depths. "The regret you feel is a sign of your care, a reflection of your heart, but it's time to let it go and embrace the strength you've discovered within yourself." Her words reshaped me, teaching me to set boundaries without the shame that had once held me back, a skill that transformed my relationships from fragile threads to steel cables. At work, I threw myself into a project, designing a marketing campaign for a local nonprofit, the hours spent sketching ideas, a distraction from the pain, and my efforts won a client's praise, a nod of approval that bolstered my spirit. Mr. Daniels noticed, calling me into his office with a rare smile, offering a promotion to team lead, a role that demanded the assertiveness I'd honed through this ordeal. A position that required me to lead with the courage I'd found. I accepted, my voice firm and clear, a stark contrast to the hesitant tones of my past, my head held high as I stepped into a future of my own making. The weight of family expectations lifted, replaced by a self-assurance that felt like a shield, protecting me from the judgment that still lingered in the air like a faint mist. The relationship with my parents evolved into a fragile new normal, a tapestry woven with threads of hope and caution. 2 months after the confrontation, Thomas called, his voice gruff but softened by a trace of warmth, a sound that hinted at a thaw in his anger. "We've been talking, Sophie," he said, his words measured. "We're not ready to see Laura yet, but we miss you, and we want to try to understand." We agreed to meet at a neutral cafe, the air thick with unspoken words, as we sat with coffee cooling between us, the clink of cups a delicate rhythm in the background. Ellen's eyes were red-rimmed, her hand trembling as she reached for mine across the table, her fingers cold against my skin. "We were wrong to shut you out," she admitted, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of her regret. "You saved us from more pain, from living a lie we couldn't see." The reconciliation was tentative, marked by awkward silences that stretched like shadows and stilted conversations that danced around the edges of our hurt. But it was progress, a seedling pushing through cracked soil. They began visiting occasionally, bringing homemade pies that filled my kitchen with the scent of cinnamon, a gesture that mended some of the fractures with each bite. Thomas even asked about my work, a rare curiosity that warmed me, his questions about my promotion a bridge across the divide. Though the topic of Laura remained a minefield, we tiptoed around with care. The distance was painful, a scar that throbbed with memory, but it taught me the value of boundaries, a lesson etched into my heart with the ink of experience, a boundary that allowed love to flourish without suffocation. Laura's efforts to rebuild her life gained traction, a slow climb from the pit she dug with her own hands, a journey of redemption that unfolded with each step. She moved into a shared apartment with a roommate she met through her cafe job, working double shifts that left her exhausted but determined, her social media posts shifting from lavish outings to humble updates about saving money for a future she could call her own. One evening, she appeared at my door, a small box in hand, her knock hesitant but firm. "It's the first $200 I saved," she said, her eyes downcast, avoiding my gaze as if ashamed of the past. "And I'm sorry, Sophie, for everything, the lies, the pain, the way I used you all." I took the money, my fingers brushing hers, a fleeting contact that carried the weight of our history, and nodded, the gesture a step toward forgiveness I wasn't ready to fully embrace, a door left ajar rather than wide open. She started attending a support group for financial recovery, a choice that surprised me with its maturity, and shared progress reports via text. Paid off another $50 this week, each one a brick in a bridge we might one day cross with trust. Her change wasn't complete. Old habits lingered, like a late-night call asking for advice on managing tips, a reflex of dependency. But it was a start, a flicker of hope in the wreckage, a light that promised a different path if she chose to follow it. My future began to take shape, a canvas I painted with intention and care, each stroke a reflection of the strength I'd found. I planned a solo trip to the coast, a week to clear my mind and breathe free air, booking a cabin with views of the ocean that stretched to the horizon, a reward for my resilience that I'd earned through fire. The thought of the waves crashing against the shore filled me with anticipation, a promise of renewal. At work, I mentored a new hire, a young woman named Claire, who reminded me of my younger self, sharing the lessons of standing firm against adversity. My leadership a mirror of the courage I discovered. The project I led won an award, a plaque that sat on my desk, a tangible symbol of my growth that bolstered my confidence. Mia and James remained my pillars, inviting me to game nights that filled my apartment with laughter, a sound that had almost faded from my life, replaced by the joy of their company. We discussed starting a small support group for those betrayed by family, a project that felt like a calling, a way to turn my pain into a beacon for others, a community where stories like mine could find solace. In Portland, where the whispers had once judged me with a harsh tongue, I joined a community garden, planting seeds alongside neighbors who offered quiet smiles, a sign of acceptance that healed old wounds with each sprout that broke the soil. The lesson I carried was profound, a revelation that reshaped my understanding of love and self. Boundaries are the foundation upon which true relationships stand. I learned to say no, to protect my peace without the guilt that had once chained me, a skill that transformed my interactions from fragile threads to steel cables that could bear the weight of truth. With Laura, I set clear limits. No more loans that vanished into her pockets, no unsolicited visits that reopened old wounds, guiding her toward independence with a firm but fair hand, a teacher rather than a savior. With Thomas and Ellen, I established regular calls on Sunday evenings, avoiding the triggers of the past, fostering a cautious trust that grew with each conversation. About neutral topics like the weather or my work, a trust that allowed love to breathe without suffocation. The betrayal had stripped away the illusions I'd held, revealing that love requires strength, not blind loyalty, a love that stands firm against deceit. As I stood in my garden one evening, the soil cool and rich under my hands, the scent of earth and blossoms filling the air, I felt a peace I hadn't known before, a growth rooted in the ashes of that painful truth, ready to bloom into a future of my own making, a future where I defined my worth. The community garden became a sanctuary, a place where I found solace among strangers who became friends. I learned to prune roses, my fingers stained with green from the leaves, and shared stories with an elderly gardener, Mr. Hensley, who listened with a nod as I spoke of my family's fracture. His advice, "Growth comes from cutting away the dead," resonated, a metaphor for the boundaries I'd set. At work, I organized a team-building retreat, a weekend in the mountains, where my leadership shone, earning respect from peers who'd once seen me as quiet. The promotion brought new challenges, like mediating a dispute between team members, a task I handled with the calm I'd learned from Dr. Patel. Mia suggested a cooking class, and we laughed over burnt bread, a lightness that healed my spirit. James proposed a charity run, and we trained together, the rhythm of our steps a beat of solidarity. These moments built a new family, one of choice, not obligation, a network that supported my growth. Laura's progress continued, a slow dance of redemption. She enrolled in a budgeting course, her texts detailing lessons on savings that showed a shift in mindset. One day, she brought a journal, pages filled with her reflections, and read aloud an apology that moved me to tears. "I see now how I hurt you," she said, her voice steady. I offered to help her with a resume, a small step toward mending, though I kept my guard up. Thomas and Ellen sent a letter, inviting me to a family dinner, a tentative olive branch I accepted with cautious hope. The meal was tense, but their smiles over dessert hinted at healing. My trip to the coast loomed, a promise of solitude, and I packed with anticipation, ready to write my next chapter. The support group idea took shape, with Mia drafting a mission statement, a project that turned my pain into purpose. As I planted a final seed, I felt the past fade, a story of resilience that defined me, a strength born from the ashes of betrayal. Reflecting on my journey, I've come to see that Laura's betrayal, her fabricated cancer to escape debt, reshaped my understanding of family into a bond defined by courage, not blind trust. The pain of exposing her lie, the tears of Thomas and Ellen, and the silence that followed taught me that true love demands the strength to protect what's just, even when it breaks your heart. That moment when I shattered her perfect plan marked the start of my liberation, a turning point that illuminated my path. Laura's slow path to redemption, paying off debts with a cafe job and seeking counsel, reveals a flicker of growth, a fragile bud pushing through the soil of her regret. My parents and I are weaving a new bond, their cautious visits with pies a thread of hope. While I've grown into someone who sets boundaries with pride, my strength honed by this trial, Mia and James, my chosen family, inspire me to turn pain into purpose with our support group idea, a beacon for others navigating similar storms. This experience showed me my worth isn't tethered to others' approval, but to my resolve to rise against deceit. Have you ever had to confront a loved one to safeguard your values or protect those you care for? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your footing amidst the chaos. Like this video if it touched your heart or stirred your spirit, and subscribe to join a community of those who've risen from the ashes of family betrayal. Remember, your power shines brightest when you choose who earns your trust, a light that guides you through the darkest trials and into a future of your own design. As I prepare for my coastal trip, sketching plans for solitude and reflection, I carry this wisdom, ready to build a future where I define my circle with clarity, love, and an unshakable sense of self, a legacy of resilience born from the ashes of this painful chapter, a story that continues to unfold with every step I take.